Welcome to tonight's session on how we talk about it, our autism webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country, and in the spirit of reconciliation, alongside families, would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to the to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So my name is Christy. I'm coming to you from beautiful Darkinjung country. If you know whose land you're on, please feel free to share it in the chat. So I'm parent of a super rad and frankly fabulous young human who is autistic and has ADHD. And I like to say he got it from his mama because I identify as AuDHD myself. Tonight, we will hear from the amazing Sandhya Menon, an AuDHD developmental psychologist and author of the beloved books, The Brain Forest and The Rainbow Brain. And she has just brought out a new book, My Body's Power Pack. Very exciting. So tonight, some of the things we'll cover are the language around autism, what neuro-affirming means, and, sometimes why functioning labels don't tell the whole story. But enough from me. I'm going to pass over to our lovely guest. Thank you.
Thanks, Christy, for that lovely introduction. And thanks everyone for tuning in and spending your time with me tonight. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And, I was talking to Christy about what we were doing here tonight, and even just getting to show up as autistic people and talking about some of the language shifts is a huge part of, I guess, that shift, right? The fact that more people are identifying, more autistic people are being involved in talking about autism, right? And that's been part of the shift. So let's talk about it. I've got some pretty slides. Hopefully you will enjoy them. All right. So I'm going to do how we talk about autism. Here are a few of my hats. Talk about the professional hat, coming as a psychologist as well, who's really taken a look at how research is conducted, the very foundations of knowledge, and deconstructing that and what that means. And then my personal hat is coming to you as an autistic ADHDer who is also a parent to, an autistic ADHD child who operates in autistic ADHD community. Like, first of all, now I have friends, which is nice to say. And they're all autistic, and we found each other, and it's this coming together that has precipitated this shift. I am going to go into it, but I thought I'd provide a little bit of a visual for anyone who might find my name a little bit tricky. This is how you pronounce it, is Sun, and then Dia. So Sandhya Menon is a traditional Kerala name from the southern parts of India. All right, so let's talk about our history, right? Why has the way that we've traditionally talked about autism changed, right? And how has that led us to where we are today? So most of us know Leo Kanner as one of the founding fathers, or Eugene Buehler, of the first people who described autism, but that's not actually the case. Right? We actually had in 1925 a Russian Jewish scientist called Grunya Sukhareva, who identified a group of autistic children, and didn't say it, but she said, identified this group of people, and they're very sensitive, they think differently, they're very abstract styles of thinking, very different ways of communicating to people. And she described autism in a strength-based fashion back in 1925. And I think about, this is us 100 years later, having to go back and learn about and unlearn all that followed after, simply because her work was ignored back in the day. We had a woman scientist, we had a Jewish person, and Hans Asperger and Leo Kanner, a German. So those conditions led to her work being buried. And I think also her work was first published in Russian, so didn't get translated to English. And then we move along, and then Kanner's, the way that Kanner described autism became our absolute truth. Right? He's like, oh, it's like nobody has it, and all these people, are alone. Right? They can't connect with people, which laid the seeds for whose fault is it? It's the mother. And when we talked about autism in that fashion, along the lines that went, okay, these people need to be put into wellness farms and institutions. And if they weren't, it's how do we make them as normal as possible? Because we were understanding it from a medical point of view, a childhood condition that could be cured, could be made better. That's how we used to understand it in the 60s and 70s. Autism first came in as a standalone category in the DSM-3 in 1980. Right? So when we think about why didn't we hear about autism earlier, it's because it didn't really exist for clinicians to diagnose. Now the real turning point came with Jim Sinclair. Right? So in the 60s, we had the civil rights movement, and along with that came disability rights as well. So it started to, I guess, grow stronger in the 60s and 70s. I feel, right, one of the pivotal points in the 90s was when Jim Sinclair got up and gave a speech. And his speech, as an autistic person, was so rousing that really convinced people to start thinking differently about autism. So if you have the time, do go and read Jim Sinclair's speech back in 1993. Don't mourn for us. He's like, we're not broken. We hear this narrative now, but Jim Sinclair was the first one to really articulate that, as far as I'm aware. To go see us as whole, see how we communicate. And in the 90s and 2000s, with the rise of good old internet and dial-up, I don't know if any of you remember like the old chats of like IRC or MSN Messenger. That really started to play an important role in our society. What that did, if anyone was on MSN Messenger, that you would just get added to groups. And then you'd be able to talk to people from all around the world. What happened was more autistic people started talking to each other. Right. So when we were alone, when we weren't connected, when these narratives were the only narratives we knew, people started to accept that about themselves. Right. Or there were just one voice pushing back against a tidal wave that said that, you need to be fixed, or the way that you do things is wrong. But when they got together and they found greater connection, that there were people like them who they actually really liked and enjoyed, these people aren't broken. We actually really get along. So all this communication difficulties start to fade away when I'm talking to more autistic people. So the neuro-affirming movement gained traction in around the 2000s, and a lot of advocates started pushing back. Right, we got more research conducted about autistic people with autistic people. So previously, the research that we did have were scientists in a lab studying autistic people and attributing what they thought their behavior meant. The shift in research came from autistic adults being able to articulate, you're like, okay, well, this is what you see, but this is how I feel. And there's that real increase in understanding of the internal world of an autistic person that gained traction, that made us realize, what do we need to do? Talk to more autistic people and talk to a broad range of autistic people. So now, in this day, we have neuro-affirming practice is the best practice. So we see behaviorism as something that's outdated, that actually has contributed to a lot of trauma in the autistic community. Whereas if we think about autistic people and operating in community, the fundamental thing that we have to overcome or to learn is, who are we? Right? Who, like, yes, I communicate differently, but what is that difference? Right? How can I understand myself as autistic? And that's where we are today, which has come a long way in the past 100 years. It's kind of done a big bit of a circle. So, the evidence and information has changed over time, as should we. I hope those who are watching here gain as much delight as I did from this picture of the leech. It makes me laugh. We used to prescribe leeches for headaches. Now we have Panadol. I'm a left-hander. I still don't hold my pen right, but anyway, separate issue. We used to think, being left-handed was unlucky or a sign of being possessed, right? So, like, force them to work with the right hand. Didn't work. And likewise, with similar changes, we don't view autism as a disorder, right? Rather, we're looking at it as a natural variation of diversity. We're looking at it like biodiversity, where we accept all the different flora and fauna as they come. We accept cultural diversity, we accept gender diversity, and now we're understanding different brain types as part of that diversity. We weren't actually meant to all operate in the same way. Our brains operate differently, and that is natural, and that is what normal is. So when we're looking at increases in autism, we have to think about why that is. I really like this graphic from Mrs. Speechy P, who's a speech pathologist, who talks about, let's zoom out about this staggering increase in autism. Right? Over time, autism is still less than 3% of the total population. It is a minority neurotype. So not everybody is autistic. But even with the rise, we've got less than 3% of the population. And sometimes people represent it as the bottom graph, going like, look how much we've grown. And there is a fantastic article in the Conversation looking at the growth in identification rates across countries. And Australia is number 2 on that list. Some people might interpret that as, we're over-identifying people. But I see that as something to be really proud of. We're actually identifying people. Because when we don't identify them, they're popping up anyway. I think about this like whack-a-mole almost, right? If you say not autism, it's trauma, it's anxiety, it's depression, it comes up in other ways. And if we understand people through an autistic lens, that is a harm minimization lens to go. When you know yourself, you can reduce that likelihood of poor mental health outcomes. And that's what I'm really passionate about. So back to the topic. You give me a soapbox, honestly. So we've had increases in knowledge through social media because, we've gotten together. We now involve lived experience in research. Right? So we've got more information about how it might present differently. For example, in women and gender diverse people, and in a more internalized fashion. Right? So previously, how clinicians would diagnose autism is just through behavioral observation. And now we have much more information about what's going on inside. Right? So we can get some self-report data on that. We now, after billions of dollars has been poured into, finding the cure for autism, and not being able to do that, good luck to RFK Jr. finding it by September. Time's ticking. The best thing that we know is that autism is genetic. It is a brain style, just like left-handedness is genetic. And what I find as an autistic person, but also as a clinician who does autism assessments, is because of greater knowledge, so teachers might bring it to a family's attention. Their child might go through a diagnosis, obtain, a positive identification. And that triggers parents to go, oh, well, I did all of that when I was a kid. And it's this light bulb moment, when clinicians start to talk about autism is genetic. So, perhaps one or both of you should have a look at, does this also apply to you? And that's why we've got an increase in adult diagnoses. We no longer see that as a childhood, disorder, but something that exists lifelong. We have better tools to support identification. So, now we have like interoception scales, like to talk about our internal sensors. We have masking scales, and I guess tools that actually look at more nuanced presentations as well. And there is less stigma. Autism was, I can tell you even now, autism is not cool. It's not cool or fashionable to be diagnosed as autistic, but there is certainly less stigma associated with getting a diagnosis that helps make that identification a little bit more accessible. Right? So you might just be hearing a lot about it now because we are a passionate bunch. So, we make the news fairly frequently, and that's why. So looking at that big picture perspective. Let's talk about functioning labels. I made these cans because I was like, what's a fun way to think about labels? And this is how I think about labels, right? So the high functioning label gets put on the higher shelf, and the low functioning label is something that's seen as really scary and that nobody wants. And this is quite concerning if you think about, autism being something that is very broad and varied, and for us to naturally accept the diversity in that. We tend to, it's easy to think about people in silos. Or you're high functioning, therefore I accept a certain standard about you. You're low functioning, therefore I will do everything and put you in intense therapy, for example. Right? So we think that that's a really clear-cut way of doing things. And I don't know who this quote is by, so apologies, I don't know the original person, but it was so succinctly put to talk about the argument against labels. They said, high functioning denies my struggles, and low functioning denies my strengths. So often, I'll speak to the second point first. People have associated IQ with functioning, and that's not a one-to-one relation, because what is functioning? It's being able to engage in work, in school, in relationships, in community. That's not associated with IQ. I know a lot of adults with high cognitive capacity, or even children who can't go to school, who struggle on a daily basis. And that to me, that's not high functioning, right? That is, we're still finding our way through. And having worked with adults in a support capacity, people who would have traditionally been called low functioning absolutely thrive with their tasks and go to work with so much joy and have their relationships. I was like, that's, it's not okay to call that low functioning. So there is this false equivalence. So we don't use high functioning or low functioning anymore. A bit of historical context is there is a eugenicist association with functioning labels, and why we've actually moved away from using terms like Asperger's. So Hans Asperger, used to say, save the high functioning ones. I can use them, which is why, high functioning autism is associated with Asperger. But the low functioning ones, he sent to get killed in concentration camps. So, I don't advocate for that. And it's another reason to move away from it. And I think more importantly, it's, using to accept a person's humanity, to almost like make the diagnosis better, like to comfort themselves about autism. Like, oh, it's okay because he's high functioning, right? Like, no, like I don't need to be comforted about that, or to dismiss a person's humanity, which is even more shocking. So what we do instead, sorry, sometimes I just get stuck with the shock. What we say instead is, someone has low support needs, or someone has high support needs, or medium support needs. So you'll see the acronym potentially LSN for low support needs, MSN for medium, and HSN for high support needs. And we know that these support needs will fluctuate over time, right? And that's a much more fluid way of looking at a person, going, we have good days and we have good times and bad times. And in those like really tough times, we're going to need higher levels of support. So having a much more fluid definition around them. Identity first language. This is probably the most autistic thing I can do, but here's some data around the preference for identity first language. Something I love about this is it's not a research paper. It was a community survey that was done by Chris Bonello from Autistic Not Weird. And it is actually the largest survey that we have. So I think it's the most representative sample we have of the population, with 11,200 respondents. Right? And we see that 76% of people preferred identity first language, saying, I want to use autistic person to refer to myself. So, we're starting to see autism as part of us. Right? I am not a person with Indian, right? I am Indian. I was actually going through these examples with my assistant. Now, I'm not a person with gay. And she found that hilarious because she's like, oh, I'm gay. Like, I'm a person, here's gay. Hey. It's not something that we can separate from ourselves. And similarly, and this becomes a very philosophical argument, who are we without our brain? Right? Our brain informs everything about us, the way we move, the way we process, the way we communicate, the way we interact, the way we experience the world. It is us. Right? So likewise, we say, I am autistic as an overwhelming preference in the community. And that's now in the way that we refer to large groups of autistic people. Okay? If we don't know their preference, we use identity first. But best practice would always be to ask the individual, how do you prefer to be called or to be referred to? Just like how we normalize asking someone about their pronouns these days, this is a similar concept. And, I like this a follow-up question. He asked some really good questions. The people who used identity first language were much more likely to just like being autistic, to be more comfortable and confident in the identity, to people who used, to try to separate it from them. So seeing things through an autistic lens and not feeling ashamed for our processing and way of being is powerful. And I see Christy kind of smiling and nodding, going, yes, like we'll see things through autistic neurology. It makes all the difference. Right? Knowing that I was autistic helped me realize that it gave me a reason for why all my relationships struggled, right? All my friendships were different. And I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing wrong constantly. And now in autistic community, right? First, I had to identify, I had to tell people, I'm autistic. I had to find community. But now I found friendship. And, gosh, I was like, can't do math. I'm in my late 30s, somewhere. That's been a really protective factor for me at such a late age to go, I found my people, right? I wasn't just kind of floating through space. Was how it used to feel. So this webinar, right, just talking about language, some people feel like it might not make a big difference. It does. Right? I think these micro shifts have a macro impact. Right? You saw the difference between how we feel about ourselves just from language shifts. So say autistic child rather than child with autism. Say autistic rather than neurodivergent or neurospicy. Neurodivergent is actually an umbrella term for all kinds of divergences. So I think it's important to respect that that is an umbrella term. And if we're just saying autistic or we're meaning autistic, we can say it. Right? It helps reduce the stigma around being autistic. Sometimes people adopt neurodivergent as a kind of a stepping stone to calling themselves autistic, but to know that that's a stepping stone of maybe exploring how we feel about disclosing. We say autistic and we drop the word disorder, right? Any point towards it, like ASD. Now, as a clinician, I understand ASD is the official diagnosis, but we don't have to use that term in community. Right? That term belonged to people who are making decisions about us, who are studying us, who thought that we were broken and disordered. But now we get to redefine that in community. We get to take that back and we can say, no, thank you. And we move away from functioning labels to use support needs. And what that does, all these small shifts that we're making helps us support disabled individuals with a sense of dignity. And, Christy and I were talking earlier, dare we say it, even a sense of pride. And I get emotional every time it's book week. So, as an author, people will sometimes dress up as their favorite characters, and I see autistic kids dressing up as the rainforest or the rainbow brain, and I am just in tears at how they get to be proud of who they are now. It is so healing to watch. I am terrible at keeping to time, so sorry. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between disorder and disability. Right. So sometimes people think that, oh, I can't say disorder, but life is so hard. Like everything is so hard. And I completely get that. 100%. But this is the difference. Okay. Disorder means there's something wrong with you. Right? Something is broken, it's malfunctioning, and that leads to okay, well, if it's broken, we'll fix it. Whereas if we're looking at it as a natural neurotype, but a neurotype that, because it's a minority, is finding it really hard to navigate this world, finding it really hard to gain acceptance and understanding, even honestly support from government. It's a disability. Right? And a disability means that it is harder for you to move through the world than the average person. Right? That's all a disability means. And it just means, okay, things are hard. Let's support you. And I think that's such a kind way of leaning into our needs. As a parent myself, like sometimes I can accept when I need rest, and I've struggled with that. But watching my child go through it, and not being able to take control and like just protect them from everything is challenging. And using the word disability acknowledges those challenge and struggle, right? The isolation, the meltdowns, like fight or flight responses. They're not disorders. Like everyone has fight or flight responses, but we might be much more likely to go into them. So, I could leave you with anything, it would be to make the shift towards telling people that they're autistic, right? To not buy into the stigma, but to go, okay, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what's easy, what's hard, what you're good at. Because look, so many people, I had to do math for this one, but I think that's 90% of people said learning about autism had a positive impact on me overall. Right, so use an affirming lens. I have some resources to talk to your child about being autistic, but also NeuroWild has a fantastic resource. It's very widely used. There are people now who are helping you have these conversations. So we have some new information now, which is fantastic. It's changed the way we talk about autism. Amazing. Centering disability rights, centering choice, agency, autonomy, dignity in the way that we support autistic families, and to acknowledge that maybe we didn't have that previously. This is a correction. It should have happened, should we listen to Grunya, but we had to go through the process. So what we're doing now, what that shift has given us, is looking at what autistic social skills are. Going, do we really need to make eye contact all the time and sit still? Questioning, is this really the way it has to be done? Right? Acknowledging the traditional way, right, that we were brought up, those perspectives that we were brought into parenting with, and going, what do I keep and what do I change? Starting to question, is there another way of doing this? So now, rather than forcing speech, like mouth words, we explore how autistic people can communicate in a variety of ways. We look at autistic strengths and their challenges as two sides of the same coin. The very thing that sends me into a meltdown in terms of my sensitivity to noise is the same thing that gives me sensory joy when I'm in like a beautiful space, like my whole body feels it. Sometimes my whole body feels good, sometimes my whole body feels bad. They're two sides of the same coin. It's not separate. So I'm going to go, I'm trying to finish and take some questions. But if you want to just keep in contact, I try to dissect information on social media just to make it a bit more accessible. And in October, I'll be talking a lot more about ADHD. So might want to stay tuned for that. Cool.
We absolutely want to stay tuned for that. 100%. I can see that there's been a few questions going, are we getting the slides? Yes, friends.
Okay.
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a couple of questions, actually.
Okay.
Ready?
Cool. All right.
All right. So sensory needs and stimming are such a big part of many autistic lives. What's a good way to talk about them that feels positive and respectful rather than it being medical or negative?
Yeah. So I think the way that you phrase that is really nice. Just go, I have these needs, right? I have sensory sensitivities. I think these terms are inherently neutral. It's okay to say that we have needs. It's okay to talk about stimming, to say, when I'm excited, I express that with my whole body. Or, when I'm anxious, I flap my hands. And those are value neutral terms. Right? What we need to change is the value that we assign to them. To go, well, did you think that moving your hands when anxious was bad? But it's actually just neutral. Yeah. So I think it's okay. I love talking about stimming. We now know stimming to be actually quite regulatory for the autistic body.
Absolutely. I have been stimming this whole time, friends. Soothes the body. And I do have a question, one that a lot of families face, and it's when someone makes a comment about our child or children, what's a kind but firm way to respond while also holding clear boundaries?
Yeah. So I have two ways that I respond to this. One is that I know that I don't always have to respond. Right?
Mm.
As an advocate, I always feel like I need to be in my advocate role. I need to educate people. And I go, I don't have energy. And so sometimes I just go, I like exit the conversation. Or if I wanted to set a boundary, I would say, thanks, we're doing it differently. Or thanks, I'm in charge of parenting my child. So developing scripts around that when you go to, for example, like family dinners or parties where you might predict that could happen. The most autistic way possible, I go pre-prepared with scripts.
Yeah, I totally understand that. And I think it's a really valid point to know that it isn't always our job to educate people, because sometimes we don't have the energy, time, nor inclination to do so as well.
Yeah.
So knowing that you can have those boundaries is important. What do you reckon? We've got time for one more?
Yeah, go for it.
This is an interesting one from the chat, actually. And it's in the middle of an autistic child's meltdown. How do you recommend that we positively communicate to other people? Because we know these things can happen anywhere, and yeah, it can be tricky with strangers or family or other people.
Yeah. That's a tricky one. I think it depends on how the meltdown looks. So, if it's something that I need to recruit a member of the public for, like, maybe please look after my other child, just like, can you stand here with my other child for a bit while I attend to this one? Or if, my child is in flight mode and I just go, I'm being pulled, going, please take her to information or something. But if my child is simply having a tough time, my responsibility is to my child and not to these strangers. And I've learnt over time to tune that out, to just, because that just gives me more stress. And it makes it harder for me to respond in a kind and compassionate way to the person who I actually care about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we do appreciate it can be really hard to tune out sometimes. But all of these things, they're learned skills, right? It's not something that we magically develop overnight, though we wish we did. We wish there was a fantastic fairy wand for this. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's one of those skills we develop over time. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if we snap and get grumpy, like we are also, operating in that this is an emergency mode. And we can debrief with ourselves with kindness. Right? If they are trying to intervene, you can kindly put a boundary to just go, thanks, I've got it. More people make it worse. Right? Strange people make it worse, if you want to be more direct.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't feel the need to disclose that my child is autistic to every Tom, Dick, and Harry who's interested for their own debriefing purposes. That is their own medical information.
Yeah. Absolutely. I really, really love that.
Yeah.
Um, and lastly, if you could give a piece of advice to another parent, I know, what would it be?
Oh,
No, I
um,
know. Through your curly one.
yeah, you did.
I
Okay.
did.
I I think it would be to listen to lived experience advocates. That was the way that I got in. Because first, right, I was that person who was like, I'm an ADHD, I with sensory sensitivities. Um, that
Nice.
was that's okay. And then I started kind of listening to people and go, oh, wow, this is fascinating. It's really changed my perspective. And operating in that community helped me learn really deeply. And also, someone in the most autistic fashion said, you're autistic, right? I was like, no. And I took that to supervision, and she goes, oh, I thought you were already diagnosed. I was like, okay. But I think when we listen to those who are autistic, it helps us combat the stigma within ourselves. Right? Sometimes it's those mirror neurons of going, they can accept this, they've learnt, right? And seeing that modeled, that self-compassion of, I had to work from bed today, or I had to take another day off, or, we've just unenrolled our child from formal school. Seeing those experiences echoed, I think, increases our confidence to go, okay, there is another way, right? We don't have to think up of the new way by ourselves. So that would be my one thing.
Absolutely love that. It's funny, somebody in the chat earlier put that, in peer reviewed.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that was my experience. But also autistic need for certainty, right? I was like, I need to get formally diagnosed because yeah.
Honestly, you have been amazing. Absolute wealth of knowledge. I learned so much tonight, and I could see that loads of people from the chat were resonating, going, this is amazing. So thank you so much. This has been incredibly engaging, and we have really appreciated having you here with us. I also want to thank everybody for your attention and your time and your willingness, if I can get my words out, to learn and grow for your children. You're all absolutely wonderful. So
Can I
oh yes, please,
can
please.
I say one thing? I'm just looking at the chat quickly of like lots of people still maybe looking at their autism assessment. If you go on my website under the blog or like resources, I have like just a power list of people to follow. So if you are new to social media and you're not sure who, you can go to, I think it's neuro-affirming resources, and there's a list at the bottom.
You know, I'm going to find that and I am going to put it in on the resource email that I'm
Please
going
do.
to send everybody.
Yeah,
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah.
Yep. So you'll get the slides, you'll be getting the recording of this video, and you'll also get some additional resources and how to stay in touch with Sandhya as well, which is exciting, as well as how to follow us here at Alongside Families. Because, yeah, we do a whole heap of stuff. whole heap of stuff. We've got some really exciting webinars coming up, the last ones for our term. We actually have one on supported playgroups. And just how finding safe, welcoming spaces for our kids can just make such a huge difference in their lives. And we also do have a workshop coming up that's specifically for autistic parents, diagnosed, self-identified, or still exploring, who are raising neurodivergent or autistic children. That will be popped into the email as well. But otherwise, please feel free to follow us at Belongside Families. And you can find all the details and registration information for any of our events on our website, which is belongsidefamilies.org.au. That has been popped into the chat as well, but I'll also be sending that out in your email. So once again, thank you, lovely people, for joining us. Sandhya, you have just been a beautiful guest, so full of great information. We really appreciate you. And all of you folks, we look forward to seeing you at future Belongside events. Have a wonderful evening and go do something nice for yourself. You all deserve it. You do. Maybe a cup of tea and a chocolate biscuit.
Amazing. I'll take that.
Yes, please. Sounds good, right?
Cool. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
A whale, thank you. Sorry.
Oh, a little whale. That's adorable. Thank you all so much, folks. Good night. Night, Sandhya.